In November 2008, California voters were handed a ballot measure with a number on it, $33 billion. That was a promised price tag for a bullet train that would whisk passengers from Los Angeles to San Francisco in 2 hours and 40 minutes, hitting speeds over 200 miles per hour. Voters said yes. Today, that number has grown nearly fourfold. The trip from Los Angeles to San Francisco is no longer even the immediate plan, and the only thing under active construction is a stretch of track through farmland that most Californians will never use to get anywhere they actually want to go. This is a story of how a project meant to be the crown jewel of American infrastructure became a cautionary tale, and why the answer isn't as simple as the government wasted the money. The California High-Speed Rail Authority was created back in 1996, but the real countdown started in 2008 when Proposition 1A passed with just over 52% support. The plan looked clean on paper. A high-speed spine connecting the Bay Area and the Los Angeles basin, with branches reaching San Diego and Sacramento eventually. Construction was supposed to begin almost immediately, and initial service was promised by 2020. None of that happened on schedule, and as of the authority's own 2026 draft business plan, the full Phase 1 cost between San Francisco and the Los Angeles/Anaheim area is now projected at roughly $126 billion, with some independent estimates running even higher when financing costs are included. The opening date for the full system has slid into the 2040s. The only piece actually under construction is the Central Valley segment between Merced and Bakersfield, a corridor that, while important for connecting smaller cities, was never the point of the project in voters' minds. To understand how this happened, you have to understand what makes high-speed rail different from a normal train line. Conventional railroads can tolerate tight curves and uneven terrain because trains crawl along at 50 or 60 miles an hour. A train moving at 220 miles per hour needs long, gentle curves and a remarkably flat, stable corridor, or passengers in freight cars alike would be thrown around violently. That requirement means high-speed rail planners can rarely just lay tracks alongside an existing highway or railroad and call it done. They need a nearly straight shot, and in a state as geographically chaotic as California, with mountain ranges boxing in nearly every major city, finding that straight shot is its own engineering nightmare. Nowhere was this more obvious than the question of how to get the train out of Los Angeles. The Los Angeles basin is encircled by mountains, and any route north has a thread through one of a handful of passes. Planners weighed two main options: a route through Tejon Pass, which is the most direct path and follows the corridor used by Interstate 5, and a longer route swinging east through Palmdale. On paper, Tejon should have won easily. It was shorter. It followed existing infrastructure, and the environmental groundwork was already partially done because of the highway. Yet the authority chose Palmdale, a decision that added several extra minutes to the trip, and has remained one of the most disputed calls in the project's history. Critics point to an unflattering explanation. In the project's early years, a Los Angeles County supervisor representing the Palmdale area was a vocal advocate for routing the train through his district. A separate board member tied to property holdings elsewhere in the county allegedly traded support for the supervisor's lease renewal in exchange for backing the Palmdale alignment. If true, it's an ugly story, and it's become a go-to talking point for anyone arguing the whole project is fundamentally corrupt. But treating it as the entire explanation oversimplifies what happened. The land that the Tejon route would have crossed is controlled by a large private landholding company that has spent years preparing the area for major housing development. The company fought hard against a rail line cutting through what it considers its highest value real estate, and had also negotiated a separate deal with environmental groups to place large portions of its land into conservation, complicating any attempt to seize it through eminent domain. Rather than risk a drawn-out legal battle against a well-funded landowner and a coalition of environmental organizations, the authorities planning assumed the Tejon route will require extensive tunneling to avoid the disputed land. That assumption alone is estimated to have added billions of dollars to the Tejon option, closing much of the cost gap between the two alignments. Whether that assumption was fair is still argued about today, but explains why a seemingly obvious choice wasn't actually as obvious as it looks from the outside. Palmdale also had a case for itself beyond politics. The Antelope Valley has room to grow in a way that the already dense Los Angeles basin does not, and a rail connection could turn it into an affordable commuter hub, easing pressure on the region's brutal housing costs. There was also a forward-looking argument. A separate, privately financed high-speed line connecting Las Vegas to the outskirts of Los Angeles was being planned around the same time. If California's system ran through Palmdale, the two networks could someday be linked across the open desert, letting Bay Area travelers reach Las Vegas and giving the Vegas line a path deeper into Los Angeles. That connection isn't built and isn't guaranteed, but both projects deliberately chose compatible technical standards just in case, leaving the door open. The Central Valley presented a different set of headaches. The flattest, most agriculturally simple stretch of the entire route still came with hard choices. One option ran the line in or alongside Interstate 5, the most direct path. The other ran further east, through cities like Fresno, Bakersfield, and Merced, where most of the valley's population actually lives. The I-5 route was cheaper and faster, but it would have stranded the rail line miles and the people who might ride it, undermining ridership and, just as importantly, undermining the political support the project needed from Central Valley representatives. Choosing the eastern route meant more bridges, more environmental review, and tricky negotiations with two competing freight railroads, one of which flatly refused to share its right-of-way, fearing future capacity needs of its own. The other agreed to cooperate for a price, but routing decisions still had to dodge protected historic sites and navigate small towns that didn't want a bullet train running through their main streets. One town's bypass alone went back and forth between eastern and western routings for more than 2 years after planners discovered the local water table was far shallower than expected, an expensive surprise that soured relations with the community and helped trigger over a decade of litigation. Then there was the Bay Area approach, arguably the project's most contentious environmental fight. Two mountain passes offered a way in, one to the northeast, which would have followed an existing rail and highway corridor through growing cities, and one further south, which avoided a difficult new crossing of the bay itself. The northern route had a structural flaw. It couldn't easily serve both San Francisco and San Jose with the same trains, forcing an awkward split in service that would have hurt frequency and competitiveness for both cities. The southern route solved that problem but ran through more sensitive, less developed terrain, drawing years of lawsuits from environmental groups and nearby residents. Step back from any single decision, and a pattern emerges. At nearly every fork in the road, planners chose a more ambitious, more expensive, more politically inclusive option over the cheaper, more direct one. They wanted to serve nearly every meaningful population center along the corridor. They wanted speeds that would rival or beat the best systems in Europe and Asia. They wanted to build through city centers instead of routing around them, preserving direct access for travelers instead of forcing transfers on the outskirts. Each of these choices was individually defensible, often even admirable, but collectively, they produce a project with very little room for the kind of cost-cutting compromises that get other high-speed lines built on time and on budget. That ambition was baked into the original promise voters approved. The 2008 plan assumed European-level construction costs and timelines, despite the fact that California had no recent experience building anything like this, and despite a route that had to cross seismically active mountains and dense urban environments that European systems frequently avoid. It also assumed funding sources that never fully materialized. Voters approved roughly $10 billion in state bonds, a fraction of what the full system would ultimately need, with the rest expected from a mix of federal grants and private investment that consistently fell short of projections. When the federal government pulled roughly $4 billion in funding in 2025, it only widened a gap that had never really closed. The result is a project now defending itself on two fronts. To the public, surging cost estimates and a moving completion date look like exactly what skeptics always said they'd be: proof of government incompetence or worse. To planners and engineers who lived through the actual decision-making, the failures were less about corruption and more about a voter-approved blueprint that was financially unrealistic from day one, compounded by years of necessary but slow environmental review, land disputes, and local political negotiation that any infrastructure project of this scale would have faced in California regardless of who was in charge. Neither view fully lets the project off the hook. Some of the routing choices, especially around the Tejon Pass alignment, deserve genuine scrutiny, and the alleged political dealing around Palmdale is a real stain even if it wasn't the sole deciding factor. At the same time, dismissing the entire project as pure waste ignores just how difficult and expensive it is to build genuine high-speed rail through a state shaped the way California is, surrounded by mountains, crossed by active fault lines, and packed with competing landowners, cities, and interest groups who all have a legitimate stake in how a 500-mile railroad gets built through their backyard. What's left now is a half-finished commitment. Construction continues, slowly, on the Central Valley segment connecting Merced and Bakersfield, the part of the system that was always the easiest to build and serves the fewest people directly. Completing the rest of the route to Los Angeles and San Francisco remains technically possible but financially uncertain, dependent on private investment, future state budgets, and a federal government that has shown little appetite for supporting it. Whether California ever finishes what it promised voters in 2008 is still an open question. But the project's troubled history offers a clear lesson for any government weighing a similarly ambitious idea. The gap between what's possible to build and what's politically possible to promise can sink a project just as surely as any mountain range or lawsuit ever could.